Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. I'm really excited to share this episode with you. I got the privilege to sit down with a new friend, Grote, who I found out about when I Googled Lacan and Zen Buddhism, which I'm currently trying to piece together and think about. And his dissertation popped up, an episode that he recently did with one of my favorite podcasts, The War Machine, came up. And I instantly fell in love with him and his writing and his thinking. And so I reached out to him and he was gracious enough to be a guest on Psyche. So I'm really excited to share this conversation with you. We explore human subjectivity, various aspects of Lacanian psychoanalysis. We go deep into various components of Zen Buddhism. He brings up one of his favorite American philosophers, Richard Rorty. We talk about the American spiritual author, Richard Rohr, and so much more. This was a great episode. I'm hoping it's not the last time that Luke will be a guest on Psyche Podcast. And as always, I'm hoping that you and anyone that will listen to this podcast will continue the conversation. Luke, thank you so much for being a guest on my podcast, Psyche. I'm super excited that we got connected. I know that whenever you asked me how I found out about you, I was currently thinking about the relationship between Jacques Lacan and Zen Buddhism, which don't get put together very often. And so I just searched that on Google and your dissertation came up. Your episode with The War Machine came up, and I really dig those two things. And so I kind of reached out and we're going to have this conversation, which I'm really excited about. So thank you for being open to some random guy on the internet connecting with you.
No, that's great. I'm excited about this. Thank you.
Yeah. So maybe where we can begin, if you're cool with this, is as I just mentioned, you're kind of bringing together, especially in your dissertation, human subjectivity in light of Lacan and then Zen Buddhism. Can you take a couple steps back and just maybe explore with me how you brought those two kind of streams of thought together? Maybe getting into a little bit of your biography, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, I come out of a Protestant Christian tradition. I guess that's an important background for me. And though it doesn't come to the surface a lot in my dissertation, in one chapter that you didn't see, what I'm trying to do is rework this notion of original sin.
Okay.
And
that's a big one.
Yeah. But, Augustine famously said that, original sin is passed down through sexual reproduction, right?
Right.
So I'm trying to say that original sin is passed down through cultural reproduction. That culture gets so deeply ingrained in us that it's really hard to separate the cultural from the biological. Lacan will say that even desire is deeply formed by cultural influence.
Yeah.
Anyway, trying to retain an element of my Protestant background was important. And I was an evangelical for a little while. The notion of, I guess, being born again is not something I have thrown out completely.
Okay.
What I've thrown out is that being born again puts you in this special club of people who get to live forever, and that kind of stuff I've thrown out. But I've retained this notion that spirituality is about the radical transformation of subjectivity. And then I learned through my schooling about post-structuralism. And one element of post-structuralism is the decentering of subjectivity. Saying that these selves that we believe we are, we're not as in control as we are, and we're not at the center of our existence the way that we think that we are. There are all kinds of forces preceding us and around us that deeply inhabit us and decenter the sense of conscious rational control. So in my dissertation, I'm trying to put this decentering of the subject in conversation with a transformation of the subject. But in this transformation of the subject, you don't join a special class of people and everyone else is kicked out into Gehenna or whatever. You become what we all are. like the Buddha nature inhabits all of us. Right? So in Hinduism and Buddhism, salvation is a matter of becoming what we all are, instead of like joining a special club for the elect or whatever. And so you have a notion of a transformed subject, but without the rigid bifurcation between those who undergo this process and those who do not.
Sure. This is, I know this is a big question, but what's coming up for me is just to kind of explore this for a second. In traditions within Christianity, like Calvinism, and there's probably other religious traditions where this happens, where there's that sharp bifurcation between these two groups of people. Have you reflected on why that emerged within these groups? I mean, I know that on the one hand, they're maybe trying to be faithful to certain biblical text or a theological logic, but in terms of like sociological factors or these cultural realities that you've been describing, are there reasons why some of these groups tend to move in that direction, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's even way beyond Calvinists. Any conservative evangelical does hold to some version of that, of there's an in and there's an out. Remember Rob Bell? You familiar with Rob Bell?
Yeah, I am.
He wrote a book, Love Wins.
Yeah, I read it a long time ago, but it was a good book.
It was so controversial in evangelical circles. He was pretty much booted out of evangelical circles by saying that everyone gets saved in the end. Because evangelicalism, especially in this country, is predicated on there being an inside and outside.
Right.
And I think, yeah, there are. I mean, you can go. There are a lot of sociological and theological reasons behind that. It's clearly in the New Testament. It's clearly Jesus. It's something that Jesus taught. Unfortunately, it's clear that it's something that he taught. But you got to remember, Jesus also troubled the notion of a religious inside versus outside. He was often seeking outsiders. But there's an element of a reverse logic there, where instead of being like Derrida and deconstructing the binary, it just gets turned upside down, and there's a new inside and outside. And this is what Nietzsche was talking about in The Genealogy of Morals.
Okay.
How you had a kind of slave revolt of morality, as he called it. I don't think Nietzsche is completely right, but there's an element of truth in that. Sure.
And I know too, like as you've mentioned in other interviews and in your dissertation, you got into the post-structuralist, but you also really enjoyed Lacan. I mean, maybe because of his being connected to Freud and Freud's discovery of the unconscious. I think that's an important component in your thinking as well.
Yeah, definitely. We talked about the decentering of the subject, and there's nothing as decentering as this notion of the unconscious.
Agreed.
It determines so much. And so whereas other post-structuralist thinkers decenter the subject in a way that they don't really delve into the depths of the subject the way Lacan does. Lacan really, he's a psychoanalyst, so he thoroughly analyzes the subject. And so the unconscious is incredibly important. What Lacan does differently than Freud is Lacan was more philosophically erudite than Freud, and he brought Hegelian and structuralist theories into his analysis of the subject. And he felt that language and law were deeply embedded in the unconscious.
Yeah. How do you, I've asked this question to several Lacanians. I'm always curious the different nuances. How do you understand his statement that the unconscious is structured like a language?
So basically, we live and we're always internalizing cultural influence, right? And this cultural influence gets stored inside of us. And it gets stored in the unconscious. And so it takes on a structure in the unconscious as words link to other words. In proteins, you have amino acids that link up to other amino acids, and they form a chain. And then this chain bends on itself, and it creates tertiary and quaternary structures that are very complex, becomes a complex protein, right? It's similar with words in the unconscious. They get internalized, and they link up with each other, and they can create this complex structure. It's like the structure of not simply of a language that's spoken, but a language in the terms of Ferdinand de Saussure, where the words we linked are always, their meaning is always linked to other words that are not present.
Mm.
And so there are all these linkages of language and law. Language and law are the two main things that Lacan emphasizes in the unconscious. And so the language and law that we're surrounded with, we don't have to think of law simply in terms of laws that are on the books, right? But if any social interaction, when we socially engage another person, we're following a set of laws. How far apart do I stand? How do I begin this conversation? How do I respond? There's a narrow range of responses that are available to a certain statement. So this is all kind of law. And we internalize this law, it gets stored in us, and we internalize this language, and these words link up with each other and form a structure inside our unconscious that's analogous to the structure of the society in which we live.
Mm. That's powerful. Well said. Would you see if I could formulate this how I want it to come out for those who maybe kind of flippantly talk about just being, radically individualistic and, saying fuck you to society. I'm gonna just do my own thing. I've always thought that sounds great, but it's not realistic, and it's missing everything you just said about the human experience.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. The other thing too, and I know you and I connected over this, I don't know if you'll see it quite this way, but given that I work with a lot of young men and older men on the autism spectrum, given that so many of them have such a difficult time understanding things like social norms and social cues, to me, it's just exemplified or amplified what you were saying a moment ago, that this is something that actually exists in us, because there's this group of people that actually struggles with it so much. It reminds me of how central it actually is to the kind of quote unquote normal human experience. Yeah,
exactly. And like I shared with you, I was never officially diagnosed with, autism spectrum or whatever, but
Sure.
I think I might be on the spectrum because just the ordinary way people behave has always been somewhat foreign to me. And I've always been somewhat foreign to other people. So I've only been able to study what other people do and try to learn it. Whereas I find that other people with social cues and social norms, it comes quite naturally. And it has never come quite naturally for me.
Got you. There's this great autism researcher. She's a bit controversial in some circles. Temple Grandin, she herself is autistic. Oliver Sacks, the great neurologist, did a piece on her in the 90s. And the title of the kind of interview / chapter in his book is a line that she said, being autistic in this world is like being an anthropologist on Mars. And I thought that was well said.
Yeah.
Now, okay, Luke, so you a moment ago answered my question of how you first brought together Lacan and Zen Buddhism when you were thinking about your kind of Protestant past, and I think wanting to kind of think through original sin and maybe the doctrine of regeneration. In the chapter that you sent me that I read, from your dissertation, you really begin to explore the problem of dualism. And maybe I was hoping you could kind of set that up a little bit, maybe describe what dualism is, and then maybe how Lacan and Zen Buddhism think about this problem of dualism.
Sure. So dualism is, from a Zen perspective, there are two main dimensions to Buddhism. And one dimension of Buddhism is the sense that I am separate from ultimate reality. And in both Zen terms and Hindu terms, that is false. But it's a fiction that we have to undergo and break out of. So that's the first part of dualism. The other part of dualism is that all of our social constructs are predicated on dualism, dualistic language, dualistic beliefs. We're talking about the theology of there being an inside and outside. I think that's a fundamental sociological principle for a group. It has to define what's inside and what's outside.
Yeah.
And that inside versus outside translates into other dualisms. that also refer to elements within the group. Mary Douglas has talked about in the founding of an institution, what gives institutions their intellectual credence is a set of founding binaries in which the very structure of the group, the binary structure of the group, is linked to ultimate reality or nature. So men over women is linked to the right hand, the supremacy of the right hand over the left hand. And then these binaries link to other binaries and create simultaneously the institutional structure and the structure of the thinking of the members of the group. So we think about computer codes. The main computer code is binary, 0 or 1. Right. The complexity of the computer is based on this basic binary, 0 or 1. Jacques Derrida looked at the history of the Western philosophical tradition, and we hear the word deconstruction thrown around a lot. But what deconstruction is it's looking at the binary structure of different texts from the Western tradition and showing how these binaries are employed in such a way that there's one term that's supposed to be better than the other, but there's another term under it. Male and female is the classic example. One that Derrida loved in his early career was speech versus writing. He felt like speech was always privileged with respect to writing, because when you're speaking, you're in the presence of the other person, and you can modulate what you're saying according to how the other person responds and understands. There's a vitality in speech, but he always saw that writing has been associated with death, because it can go anywhere and be read by anyone, and you're not there to correct it. And it's apart from your presence, so it's like the death of you. But Derrida did not agree with this binary. Right? He tried to show how elements of writing are involved inside of speech. That speech is not purely primary, or that in any binary, the higher term depends on the lower one. And so he showed in his analysis of these binaries that govern these texts, how sometimes the lower term could be superior, or sometimes the lower term could be in the higher term, and the higher term could be in the lower term. So the binary is not unequivocal. It's employed in such a way as to make one term supreme, right? But it never worked out that way in the texts he analyzed. There's always an inner betrayal of that. So Derrida's whole project is to undercut Western dualism. So dualism is very much a part of our cultural constructs and the way we think. Good and evil is a classic dualism. Nietzsche said that the history of Western philosophy is based on these dualisms and that they need to be questioned. So there are Western and Eastern ways to trouble dualism. The koan of Zen Buddhism. What is the sound of one hand clapping? Koans are a way to overturn dualistic thinking and open up a dimension in the mind that is beyond thinking and beyond the ego. The ego itself is dualistic because it creates a separation between the self and the rest of the world. Oops. Sorry. And this is the very separation that Hindu and Buddhist spirituality is trying to get you to overcome.
Right.
Jacques Lacan will say that the ego is not it's not naturally developed. It's something that's internalized. It's a fiction that's internalized. You need to develop an ego, but it's fictional and it's deluding. And so I didn't say anything about Lacanian dualism. Well, Lacan, in a certain sense, he was strongly Hegelian. And in Hegel, you have a troubling of dualism and a retention of dualism at the same time. Because in the dialectic, there's initially one, there's a negation of the one to create two, but then the two is negated to create a third higher term, the synthesis. So there's a two, there's a one, and then there's a two, and then there's a third, and the third posits a new contrasting other, and then that is resolved. So in Hegel, you have a three, and this threeness is what dominates Lacan. But Lacan, there's a patriarchalism in Lacan, and there is an undercutting of patriarchalism in Lacan. So in Lacan, basically, men are superior to women in Lacan for the most part. It's really problematic. But he also talks about how the way our gender is formed, and it's kind of a long and messy road. It's not like natural genders that are fixed. So he helped to open up gender and show how the formation of gender is very constructed. But he assumed an ideal fixed position of cisgendered heterosexual male and a cisgendered heterosexual woman. All right, I've talked for a long time on this question. Sorry.
Oh, no, this is great. Man, there's just so much that I want to ask you about it. But I guess in terms of like Zen Buddhism for just a second, if it's trying to trouble this dualism that you're talking about, I hate the word, what is the solution to it? But can you speak more to, in your understanding, how it tries to, I don't know the best way to say it, get us past the dualism, or kind of what's its vision of overcoming this dualism? I wonder if you could speak about it theoretically and then practically as well.
Okay, theoretically, it's trying to get you to wake up to this oneness with what is ultimate, called emptiness. Emptiness is actually defined in different ways. For some thinkers, it's actually a ground, right, of emptiness. For some people, emptiness is not anything at all. That everything is so interconnected, dependent origination, that you tap into that, but there is no real ground there. So there's either way you're tapping into ultimate reality. Either way, there's a sense that you become separate from ultimate reality. Maybe you become separate existentially, but not ontologically.
Okay.
So your task is to marry your existence with your essence that is one with this, while also troubling the binaries of language, which reflect our dualistic cultural codes. So not trusting so much in language, not trusting so much in thought, not trusting so much in teaching. It's a transmission of spirituality with minimal discourse.
Okay.
You think in contrast to Protestantism. Protestantism is the wordiest.
Oh yeah, with all the creeds and confessions.
And the long, very verbal theological approaches.
Yeah, long sermons.
The word. And an unfolding of the word, an explication of the word. If you look at Karl Barth, he wrote this Church Dogmatics, which is like this long. And it was all, the primary thing is the word of God. But the word of God needs to be expounded dialectically, and it just goes over and over again. All this wordiness. Zen is the direct antithesis of that.
Okay.
Minimal usage of words. In Zen, if you have a student who's trying to get really metaphysical, the Zen teacher will point to something very mundane. And there is very much, Zen is individualizing and de-individualizing at the same time, because it wants you to tap into your inner spiritual resources and not rely on a teacher, not rely on a discourse, not rely on a sacred text, because it's all in there. You're ontologically one with emptiness, and that just has to be woken up to. And more thinking and more learning can go in the wrong direction. There is thinking and learning, but it's relativized. It's called a direct transmission. Direct because you don't need the circumlocution.
Sure.
You need to cut to the chase. You need to stop seeking because the answer is inside of you. So meditation is important because it's a way of going inside of you and also getting a distance from that inner voice in you, which is not you. There is no thinker. Zen. In Lacan, really, there's hardly a thinker at all either. And that's one link between the two. This notion, this is, I am the thinker of this voice in my head. That is an illusion in Buddhism. So spiritual practice is a way to enter an awareness within that is kind of behind that incessant strain of thinking. And you can say, oh, this is kind of going on its own. There's no real thinker here. There's just thoughts. It's said that some people think that meditation is just trying to stop thinking. That's not really it. You can
Good luck with that.
You can have thinking going on in meditation. What it is it's about being that place inside of you which is not identified. Now, identification is key in both Lacan and Zen.
Okay. Speak to that.
Identification is how the ego is formed. Lacan, the ego is formed primarily through the mirror stage. With 6 to 18 months, the child identifies with its image in the mirror and identifies with it, saying, that's me. And the parents are encouraging this, right? Look. And then so the child makes a movement and sees that the way that it moves is reflected in the image. And eventually says, that 16, 18th month, it begins to say, hey, that's me. And it looks at it and it's jubilant and it bends towards the image. It's like enamored with it. That image is internalized as a sense of self. So what is derived and two-dimensional and inverted, the image becomes primary for identity. And that becomes a necessary stage, but a source of a lot of problems and delusion. Because inside the child at the time, there is not the unity of the image. The unity in the image is an ideal. So the child sets up a rivalry with its own image. In a sense, it is disunified compared to the image. And so it's kind of aiming for this image and can never reach it. And that just persists. And also further images of other children are identified with and internalized. This image is internalized because it becomes a rootstock of the internalization of other images, which are incorporated into a sense of self. So this sense of self, which has been taken to be throughout history, be natural and primary, is itself derived by internalizing outside images and identifying with them. So identification is the process by which the false self forms. And so Zen technique, though that, most of them don't know Lacan, it's a way of detaching from this identification with emotion and thinking especially. Because the ego, when emotion and thinking come into the mind, the ego identifies with them and makes it its own. I am the self who feels this. I'm the self who's thinking these things. And that's identification. And that's what Zen Buddhism is trying to break you from.
Yeah, that's really good. Okay, so I think one of the questions that's coming up for me, and I was hoping we would get to this, I think this is a good spot to ask it. I'm going to probably create caricatures of both sides, but then maybe you can help me understand why that's wrong and how you would understand it. But I think my initial struggle with bringing Zen Buddhism and like Lacanian psychoanalysis together is, again, these are caricatures, but I understand Zen Buddhism as in some ways trying to get us to kind of end desire or to not attach to anything. And then Lacanian psychoanalysis at one level is all about the exploration and maybe even amplification of desire. How is maybe that a mistake that I'm making and seeing that as a contradiction? And how do you kind of unravel that knot a little bit?
You're not entirely wrong. You're right so in Zen, you're trying to detach from desire. Whereas in Lacan, it's a little Lacanian desire. Lacan's notion of desire is a little bit more complicated.
Sure. So
it's more like, first, a couple things about Lacanian desire. It's never simply your own desire. There's the desire of the ego. And the desire of the ego, we said how the ego is formed by internalizing externality. Same thing with egoic desire. It's a matter of external things primarily, and it's not really your own, because your ego is not really your own. Lacan says, I is another. I is another. So this is like a foreign and debilitating desire for Lacan. There's also a desire, another form of desire, which is a desire of the big other. And the big other is the cultural order. And like I said, this cultural order gets internalized in your unconscious.
Right.
So in addition to all this linguistic and law-like formality within the unconscious, there's also desire, because desire gets inextricably bound up with language. And so you have this desire, which is also not simply your desire, but primarily the desire of the big other. And it's inhabiting your unconscious, but it's more the way this gets worked out. This is where your true desire is, even though it's not completely your own. And it gets worked out through your history and the way that you engage through the cultural order and the key incidents that get internalized. And so there's a desiring history embedded in your unconscious. And so look, for Lacan, we can get estranged from this desire and caught up in egoic desire. But he's not simply saying we need to simply liberate the desire in the sense of act on this deep desire, but we need to translate it into speech.
Okay.
So bringing it up from the unconscious and translating it into speech is the psychoanalytic process. So Lacan is more affirmative of desire than Zen. But it is a bit more complicated than saying that he's just trying to expand desire.
Okay. You know, and I know this isn't quite fair to you, because I think we talked about the fact you hadn't read it yet, but there's this book that I talked to another person about last week, The Philosophy of Zen Buddhism by this Korean philosopher, Byung-Chul Han. And we both kind of agreed that he had a pretty extreme kind of version of it, but it just seemed like his vision of like the perfect Zen person would be this radical desubjectivity, no internal experience, just almost like objects just relating to each other in this type of emptiness. And I guess when you hear that, not having read the book, so I know that's not fair, is that the type of Zen Buddhism that you would want to embrace, or how would you kind of nuance it, given that you're also drawn to all these other sources? What's your sort of vision? I guess I'm wondering about what a Zen life would look like, how some might interact with others.
From what I've read, it's not this kind of bare bones experience, but it's actually a more expansive experience.
Okay.
Because you're tapping into this dimension of yourself that you've always been relying on, but it's been kind of suppressed. And so when there's a full flowering of this in the subject, there is less attachment to sort of the noise in the mind. There can be some noise in the mind, but it's not loaded down with the self. But there's also more expansive, and I think there's like a finer quality to all experience, because the illusion of separation just prevents you from experiencing things as they are. That the ego is not simply introjected, but egoism is projected onto the world. So we experience this world of all these separate things. But for someone who's awakened, this separation is illusion. There's an underlying emptiness in which all things are connected. And even ordinary things become very sacred.
I think, and what you just said, I mean, resonates a lot. I have to think more about it, but I could see that. So it's not really a diminishing of human experience. It could be an expansion of it in some ways.
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
I've been reading, there's a California native who's a Zen Buddhist teacher, and his writings are incredible. They're a lot more personal than the authors I used in my dissertation. His name is Adyashanti.
Okay.
But he's helped me to see some of these things.
Sure. It's interesting. I mean, as I'm talking to you and thinking about your paradigm, I'm challenged because I think right now, one of the ways I sort of appropriate a type of Zen Buddhism in my own life and practice is to kind of curb desire, to work on that like monkey brain and separate from thoughts. But I don't know that I've ever really used it or thought about it as a way to kind of expand myself or connect to the emptiness or like oneness you were talking about. It's almost more as like a corrective to my rampant like ego. And so I have to kind of sit with that a little bit. I'm glad that we're talking because you're kind of challenging me in the positive direction.
And that's the way the way you're talking about it is the way Westerners typically use Buddhism.
Right. I mentioned I'm reading a book. Hopefully I'll have him on the podcast as well. Raul Moncayo, who's another person who's bringing together Zen and Lacan. And he calls what I would do and what I do kind of a Zen light. It's not really the robust kind of Zen tradition, which I acknowledge and I'm okay with.
Zizek, have you ever read any Zizek?
I have some, and my little, maybe you're going to like correct me on this, but I think it's from him that I thought, man, Lacan and Zen don't really go together. Buddhism don't really go together. He can be quite critical, right, of the Buddhist tradition.
Yeah, he's quite critical of Buddhism, especially Western appropriation of Buddhism, because he thinks it just makes people more peaceful and content with the capitalist order. So it's kind of a Marxist critique.
Sure.
It's not entirely like the opiate of the masses critique, because with the opiate of the masses critique, there's looking forward to an afterlife. And so this happiness is deferred. So I guess he's willing to acknowledge that there's some realized happiness through the practice of Buddhism, but it just makes people adapt to a problematic capitalistic order.
I could see that.
Yeah, that can happen, I think, but he's too hard. He doesn't sufficiently distinguish between like superficial Western appropriations and like the profound experience that is talked about. So that can be problematic.
Yeah, no, I could see that if he kind of pushes that too far. Now, okay, let me ask you this. At one point in the chapter you sent me on your dissertation, you kind of briefly quoted, I think it was Richard Rohr and his statement that, beliefs can become belonging systems.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering if you can maybe elucidate that a little bit and then explore how a Zen practice could help someone loosen from these strong identity markers that I think can become so problematic as we see today in our culture.
Yeah. So belonging system, let's say a belonging system, an institution, a community, a group of people, it has to have a cohesiveness in organization. Foucault talks about power, and there's unity and differentiation at the same time. And this unity and differentiation of a power structure requires a belief system. It requires people buying into it. So you buy into the belief system, and it becomes a framework for either negotiating that particular group reality, or often, as you see with the left and the right, it becomes a framework for just about everything.
Right.
So, and saying things in the right way, pronouncing the shibboleth becomes a sign of a kind of symbolic capital that shows getting along, that you belong, that you're one of us. And so, belief and belonging are inextricable from each other. And we often think of our beliefs, I'm very proud of my beliefs. I have these beliefs. If we examine what's fundamental about our beliefs, they're all conferred by groups.
Totally.
We might have an individualism to our beliefs, but this is just a constellation of the different groups, for the most part, that we belong to. In order for a belief to have the power, it has to have the force of the group behind it. So what people most define as their beliefs that are most individualistic are actually in many ways devoid of individuality. Grote talks about a final vocabulary that is sort of untouchable for everybody. What are your fundamental terms that define your beliefs? And he examined these, and he said there's often a very parochial nature to them. They're all about fundamentally fitting into some group.
Oh, that's so true. So this is Richard Rorty?
Yeah.
Okay. He's someone that I've always...
See, Richard Rohr. We got Richard Rohr and Richard
Rorty. Yeah. I've seen his name a lot, but I've actually never read anything by him. You're kind of
He's
encouraging.
Probably the most important American philosopher since John Dewey.
Okay. Is there a book that you would like if someone is interested in getting into him? Is he readable or is he
he's
kind of
readable.
Okay.
His most famous book is Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature.
Okay.
I used it in one of my other chapters of the dissertation, or contingency, irony, solidarity.
That's another one of his works.
Yeah. That's
okay. But keep going. If there was some other thing you were going to say, I know I kind of interrupted you, but I wanted to make that mental note.
But we think of belief. I'm trying to say that we think a belief is so personal, but in a way, our fundamental beliefs are so impersonal.
Oh man, that's so good.
And so anyway, so Zen is trying to remake you as a person. So it's going deep, and it will challenge your fundamental beliefs. And to be really Zen, to go all the way, is to see, like these great, postmodern philosophers have seen, that what is most fundamental for me in my belief system is constructed. And to go into Zen is to see the constructedness of human values and truth claims and identity. That this identity that I build off of my fundamental beliefs is actually a sham. And to realize an identity beyond that kind of identity. So in this way, it's similar to even Nietzsche, who challenged just the whole history of his Western inheritance.
Sure.
The fundamental values. But there's also a kind of an affirmation of the ego in Nietzsche, which is lacking in Zen. And Nietzsche said we have to create new values. Zen would say, well, if we create new values, they'll be just as false. Zen is also insisting that I can be a very virtuous person without subscribing absolutely to any values. And in that way, it's similar to the Apostle Paul.
Okay. How so?
Well, Paul recognized that the only way to be faithful you couldn't be faithful to the law simply by trying to abide by the law. That the law itself can engender egoism and desire, which preclude faithfulness to the law. So faith is kind of a leap beyond law, and the only way that you could be faithful to the law is without the law, in a sense.
Oh, I like that. Man, I'm just wondering, this is so good. Like, can you, I don't know if we want to go to like practical examples, but is there anything meaningful that you've read or in your own life where it's been a type of transcending of the law, to use that Pauline language, to reach a type of ethics that's not bound by like the letter of the law? I'm not sure if that's the best way to put it, but I'm resonating with what you're saying. I'm just not sure I can articulate it the right way. No,
you're saying it exactly right, I think. Okay. Yeah. It's recognizing, Paul said the law is holy and good, but Paul discovered that as a mechanism, it's flawed. Yeah. So in what it's trying to do, it's right, but it often fails to affect that in and of itself. I'm thinking of the work of Soren Kierkegaard. Okay. Soren Kierkegaard felt that the religious dimension was beyond the realm of the ethical. He wrote this book, Fear and Trembling. It was about Abraham and at Moriah sacrificing Isaac. And he talked about how Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac was a religious venture beyond the ethical. It made no sense at all. But it was sheer faithfulness to God. And it was a faithfulness to God that was contradicting God's former expression of faithfulness. Because Isaac was the one through whom the blessing was to be realized. So it hardly made any sense at all. And Abraham could not talk to anyone about this because no one would have understood what he was doing. So in a way, it was a venturing beyond the law, beyond the ethical, and yet it was a faithfulness to God. And so I think that's an example of, now in the Pauline example, it's in fact more radical than the Pauline example, because Paul is not saying you literally transgress the law to go beyond it, but rather through Christ and the Spirit, you go beyond it. But Kierkegaard is setting up what is actually counter to the ethical itself, and not simply to the ethical itself, but to a divine prescription.
Yeah.
That was the basis of Abraham's whole existence. And so it was self-abnegating at the same time.
Yeah, that's powerful, man. So, okay, I know I also have a question that I want to ask you about God, but there's a couple others before that. One is, so one of the things that's coming up for me is maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but I don't think that's true. I'm thinking of a lot of the clients that I see who really battle with like an anxiety disorder. I don't even think it has to be an anxiety disorder, but just humans facing anxiety. I think one of the reasons why something like Zen Buddhism is so difficult, on the one hand, while this vision of not having a self or detaching from the ego or our constructed identities, I think seems liberating. Definitely does to me. When you're in that space, at least in the beginning, it's like this giant chasm in front of you. It's also, I think, terrifying, given kind of the way our ego works. And so I'm thinking of that quote from G.K. Chesterton where he said, Christianity hasn't been, tried and found wanting. It's been found difficult and left untried, or something like that.
Yes.
And that always kind of struck me as a bit smug. So I don't want to take it in that smug direction, but I'm wondering if Zen Buddhism, if there's a similar thing to it, where if you're really going to go down that path of not attaching to the ego, be ready to face some unbelievable anxiety. And I don't know that most of us can do that. So what do you make of what I've said? I'm perfectly fine if you think I'm full of shit and wrong, but
I think, there can definitely be anxiety. One of the things that Zen talks about is you have to undergo the great death. It's the very end, though. But actually, I think it's more helpful with anxiety than inducing anxiety.
I could see that too.
Because
it's paradoxical.
What makes anxiety there's an emotion, there's an affective part to anxiety, and then there's the thought in anxiety. And so from a Zen perspective, okay, what happens is the feeling feeds the thought and the thought feeds the feeling, right?
Right.
From a Zen perspective, you can be anxious, and then you can step back from that anxiety and you can say, oh, I recognize something is going on in my body. But then you can resist all that mental interpretation that keeps it going. Or if your mind does start to interpret it, you can step back and just watch the mind do it instead of identifying with the mind's interpretation, which just keeps the anxiety, just keeps it churning and going and going and going.
Sure.
So it's actually a way, when you feel anxious, to actually not to inhabit your anxiety in a different way. So that you don't get so caught up with it, because there's a space in all of us, in our consciousness, that is never completely caught up in what's going on.
Sure. In a lot of therapeutic literature that tries to borrow from Buddhism or put itself in conversation with Buddhism, they talk about changing your relationship to the anxiety or changing your relationship to your thoughts. And I can totally see that. And I really like that.
Super.
Now, I know I kind of wanted to explore kind of the God question, but before that, I guess one question that I have for you, Luke, is I think in some circles, I think even Raul Moncaya gets into this distinction, like religion versus spirituality, that religion is more extrinsic, spirituality is more intrinsic. Do you have a perspective on that whole debate? You know, there's a lot of people that talk about being spiritual but not religious. Does your understanding of Christianity and Zen Buddhism inform any of that kind of debate for yourself? Like, I wonder where you land on that kind of question.
I think, that dichotomy has gotten a little bit played out. A lot of people insisting that they're spiritual and not religious. I think to be human is to be religious. We've developed this amazing thing, human society, and originally a lot of religiosity is simply embedded in about a celebration of societal order. But I do think it can be helpful to differentiate spirituality from religion. I think religion is based on externality, ethics, and sociality. So it's about relationships that are primarily external, not unequivocally so, because like I said, in Lacanian terms, a lot of this stuff gets deeply embedded inside of us. So it's not simply external. It gets stored in us. So we can't simply use the internal, external, but it's the source of this stuff is external, I think, for religion. Law, language, society, community, culture, ethics, morality, all this stuff is external. Whereas there's a deeper internality, I think, beyond all the stuff that we introject. And this is what I believe connects us to what's ultimate. Whatever you want to call what's ultimate is deeply internal, but it's so deeply internal that it kind of includes everything. So it's actually more expansively relational and inclusive than externally based religion, because religion is based on a proximal externality. But then there's a spiritual depth, which goes so deep as to include everything. So it's initially inward, but it goes outward at the same time. So whereas religion is outward and then gets embedded inside, this is a process of going inward and then embracing everything.
Okay, that's well said. And I think that connects to what you were saying earlier around when you kind of detach from the ego and you meditate and maybe have an experience of oneness or that emptiness, it can be a type of expansion of the self, not just a loss of self.
Yes.
Okay.
It's a loss of the false self.
Okay.
Hinduism would say it's realization of the Atman, the true self.
Right. Okay, so Luke, if you have time for one more question, I mean, I guess one of the big ones for me is, and I'll just build on the little that I know about Zen Buddhism, the different authors I've read. Usually it gets talked about as a religion without God. Some people call it atheistic. Lately, I've heard several people refer to it, Eric Fromm and Raul Moncaya, as non-theistic. Byung-Chul Han described it as radically immanent. What's your take on that? Is there still a place for God? How do you kind of frame that? I'm always curious what people do with that question.
The way I've learned to frame this is through the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead and his most brilliant theological interpreter is John Cobb.
Okay.
They talk about, Cobb talks about three ultimate realities. There is God, who's the supreme being. There is being itself, which is not the supreme being, but simply being itself. And then there is the cosmos. And it's kind of a trinity, right? And they're all connected. So what Zen or Advaita Vedanta or Taoism are tapping into is being itself. Not the supreme being, but being itself. And so God is united to that, but separate at the same time. And so, the question of theodicy is important. Like, how could a good and all-powerful God allow evil? And once upon a time, the Christian answer was, well, the fall. Every problem that we see on the earth is a result of the fall.
Right.
Obviously, we can't. That's not realistic. Obviously, if you look at the cosmos, it's not simply the work of an all-powerful and perfect creator. Why would life be so exceptional if that were the case, right?
Mm.
So anyway, positing being itself as the prime source of everything, but God as an agent who shapes things, not all-powerful, quite powerful, but not all-powerful. Because, Christians for a long time have said, look at nature. There's a purpose here. There is an order, and there is an order. And there does seem to be a purpose. It does seem that, to me, that evolution is going somewhere. But it's not the work of an all-powerful or perfect God. I see a plan in nature, yeah. But I also see disorder, chaos at the same time. So positing being itself as the fundamental creativity of the cosmos. That is beyond good and evil, as Zen insists. Ultimate reality is beyond good and evil. But God is a source of good and a shaper of reality, and the source of an intellectual principle.
Well said. That's a powerful vision, man. Yeah. Okay. So before we sign off, again, I just want to thank you for your time. This has been amazing. You've given me a lot to think about and wrestle with. Is there anything else you'd want to end with? Anything about something that's coming up in your own life, or if anyone's interested in connecting with you, where they can find you?
Sure. I could share my email.
Okay.
Is there a way to write it and post it, or?
Yeah, you know what I'll do is if I have your email, what I'll do, I'll just include it in the show notes.
Yeah.
And anyone who listens or watches, they can just reach out to you. I'm sure there's going to be people that are interested in Zen or Lacan or both that are going to want to maybe connect with you. So
super. I'm working on a project now.
Yeah.
I'm using Lacan to deconstruct the Trinity. So.
Oh man, I know you talked about that in the War Machine episode at the end, which I'll include that episode in the show notes because it was great. I was going to ask you, are you okay if I share the online PDF dissertation with everyone?
Sure.
Okay, awesome. Which I know you're kind of working on maybe transforming that into a book.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Luke, thank you again for your time. And yeah, I hope that you'll be open to coming on sometime in the future.
That would be great. Thanks a lot for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay. Have a great one.
All right. You too. Take